ऐगिरिनन्दिनि नन्दितमेदिनि विश्वविनोदिनि नन्दिनुते गिरिवरविन्द्यशिरोदिनि वासिनि विष्णुविलासिनि जिष्णुनुते भगवति हेशिति कण्ठकुटुम्बिनि भूरि कुटुम्बिनि भूरि कृते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते सुरवरवर्षिणि दुर्गरदर्शिनि दुर्मुखमर्षिनि हर्षरते त्रिभुवनपोषिणि शङ्करतोषिणि किल्बिषमोषिनि घोषरते धनुजनि रोषिणि दितिसुतरोषिणि दुर्मथतोषिनि सिन्धुसुते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते.
Hi guys, thank you for joining the live stream. Let me know if the audio is coming fine, etc. Neenar and Demshastri are here. Jai Shri Ram, guys. So today I have a very interesting paper with me, courtesy of Mr. Sociologist, of course. So this paper, I have gone through just the abstract and the conclusion of it. Okay. So this is written by someone called Andrea Major. This paper is from 2004, so she was in University of Edinburgh when she was writing this, and now she's a professor of wider world history at University of Leeds. So she has basically argued, as far as I can understand from reading just the abstract and just the conclusion, that those women who were burning themselves or let's say succumbing to the social pressure in some way, they had agency, they had self-respect, they had dignity, etc. But we could not even get to discussing those aspects of sati because people, I don't know whom she blames exactly, but let's say probably British government or academia, they were so busy tying this thread to Hinduism and talking about the evil priests that we did not get to discussing the women themselves and their agency and stuff. And she clearly mentions one interesting sentence which I've put in the thumbnail, that where is Andrea Major? She's not coming to the podcast. I'm discussing her paper. So this is one fabulous sentence that she ends with, okay, which I've put in the thumbnail. Let's see. Yeah, so Are kahan gaya? Okay, I can't find it. But anyway, the C. The courage and nobility of the unfortunate widows. That fascinated me a lot. But she basically ends up arguing, I think, which is why Mr. Sociologist sent this to me, is that she proves, going through different kinds of texts and documents, that sati had nothing to do with religion and Hinduism, to be specific. So the paper is called Pious Flames, European Encounters with Sati Before 1805. Published online on 2010, University of Edinburgh. Okay, so let's go through this paper now. On 4th December 1829, the Governor General of India, Lord William Bentinck, promulgated a regulation prohibiting the burning or burying alive of Hindu widows. This interference with Hindu custom was justified on the basis that sati was quote-unquote nowhere enjoined by the religion of the Hindus as an imperative duty. Okay, so, and this citation, I've checked it, it's actually from regulation, this is 17, right? 1829 of the Bengal Code. So the law itself said that it has nothing to do with Hinduism to begin with. During the preceding 30 years, the question of the precise religious status of sati had been integral to the debate over its abolition. While few European officials questioned the quote-unquote desirability of putting an end to the immolations, the widely held assumption that sati was an authentic and fundamental part of Hindu religious practice made the English East India Company's men wary of intervening. Okay. So it's like what they are doing with Sharia in places like Luton County today in England. That okay, if it's after all their custom, should we really interfere and stuff? Even though they are the government running it, if you are the government in the end, then you are supposed to end all injustices. But let's see how it got to blaming Hinduism, from even though it had a starting point where they were not blaming it on Hinduism themselves. Let's see. Um, once Only once the prescriptive nature of the scriptural authority for sati had been refuted did the British feel that they could outlaw the rite without violating their self-imposed principle of religious tolerance. The result of these concerns, as Latamani has suggested, was an official discourse on sati that was more about defining the parameters of colonial control than it was about burning women. By choosing to regard the act primarily as one of religious conviction, the British failed to adequately address the sociological aspects of the rite, with the result that these and the widow herself were often marginalized with their understanding of it. Hmm. I use sati both in the colonial sense to mean the practice of immolating widows, and in the more correct sense to designate the woman who performs this action. Okay, yeah. So the action and the person themselves. The prominence of the early 19th century debate on sati is in subsequent European constructions of the rite, RITE rite. Subsequent European constructions of the rite has led many scholars to characterize Western understandings of it solely in terms of the issues raised during this period. The emphasis on religion and scriptural sanction, the marginalization of the widow, and the more general vilification of sati that took place as the rite was pressed into the rhetorical service of the mission civilatris have become static points of reference they have become static points, okay, not evolving, static points of reference when discussing Western ideas about sati. Now let me check out what's the meaning of mission civilatris. I have a hunch what it might mean. Mission civilatris, I think a civilizing mission. Yeah, it means civilizing mission, guys. So interesting. She is criticizing the civilizing mission of the British Raj, for not being able to solve the problem, and also coming up with bullshit narratives on the topic. Interesting. In fact, rather than being constants, these popular 19th century assumptions were actually part of an ongoing process concerned with the creation of knowledge about India more generally. This process was clearly not static or homogeneous, but mutable and multivariate, being shaped not only by emerging relationships of power and the imperatives of colonialism, but also by ideological and social trends both in the metropole and in India. The assumptions of the early 19th century, far from representing starting points for the European construction of sati, were in fact themselves the product of shifting process of understanding that can, to a greater or lesser extent, be traced across the history of Western interactions with India. The early 19th century European construction of sati as a religious rite, for example, was in fact a relatively recent development that had emerged primarily in the 18th century and represented a considerable break from previous Western interpretations of the rite. This is where the modifications begin. The rebranding of sati begins. How do you find such papers from mysterious sociologist? Though the early 19th century European construction of sati as a religious rite, for example, was in fact a relatively recent development that had emerged primarily in the 18th century and represented a considerable break from previous Western interpretations of the rite. The Europeans who encountered sati in the 16th and 17th centuries, a period that, for the sake of clarity, I will refer to as early modern, that period, the scholarship from that period tended to view it primarily in a social rather than religious context. It was the temporal motivation of the widow, the various internal and external forces that propelled her to the pyre, rather than the religious sanction for the custom that received the most attention. Religious aspects of the rite were recognized, but for the most part, they remained peripheral to the interpretation of the widow's action until the 18th century, when new constructions of a Hindu religion and its role in Indian life pushed them to the fore. It is the purpose of this paper to look at the ways in which some common 19th century assumptions about sati came to hold general currency, and how and why they differed from earlier interpretations. To do this, I will concentrate primarily on three interconnected issues, though of course there are many others, namely The increasing importance of religion in understanding sati, the position of the widow herself within the discourse, and the nature of the moral judgments reached by European observers. Let's check out the footnotes. So Andrea Major is saying it is possible to trace European cognizance of sati back to 326 BC, when Greeks on Alexander the Great's campaign witnessed and recorded the sati of the second wife of the Hindu general Chetyaeus, and there have been fragmented references to the custom from this point on. Although the classical and medieval accounts of sati are fascinating and deeply relevant to the preconceptions which early modern travelers to India brought with them, for the purpose of this paper, I will concentrate on the period after the discovery of the sea route by Vasco da Gama in 1498, as this effectively marks the beginning of modern interaction between India and Europe. Moreover, for the sake of argumentative consistency, I will restrict myself to the classical form of sati, that is to say, voluntary immolation. Accounts of physical force being employed to compel widows to mount the pyre or make them then stay there are far from uncommon during this period. But whenever such cases of overt coercion come to light, they were invariably condemned by Europeans as murderers. As murders. Apparently, unforced satis, on the other hand, provoked a more heterogeneous and mutable reaction among European observers, so they could not decide amongst themselves that, after all, it's happening through consent, so can we really fuck with this? Thus, while the issue of physical coercion cannot be ignored in any consideration of the practice, it is in the European reactions to ostensibly voluntary acts of sati that the most telling tensions emerge. M. Shastri, I don't think she'll get to how widespread it was. She's already mentioning that there were incidents of forced sati as well. But actually, you all can ask this the next day we do a audience interaction with mysterious sociologist, but because he has some reading on this, that it was only specifically upper castes doing it. Then lower castes thought of that as the aspirational model to follow. Then they started doing it, even though they were trying not to do it for a long time. I've heard stuff like that. Okay. Ostensibly voluntary acts of sati, that the most telling. Okay. Diverse things. A note on sources. The accounts on which this study is based are derived not from official documents or even from a homogeneous group of sources sharing a common set of imperatives, but from a diverse selection of individual journals, narratives, and travelogues, as well as works of scholarship and synthesis. The very nature of these sources predisposes them to individual interpretation and provides space for a striking heterogeneity of response to sati. Far from eliciting a consistent moral reaction based on racial or cultural difference, the reactions of early modern observers show a great influence of personal subjectivity. As Barbara Court points out, travel writing, quote unquote, provides us not only with an impression of the traveled world, but the traveling subject is always laid bare. Accounts of travel are never objective. They invariably reveal the culture specific and individual patterns of perception and knowledge which every traveler brings to the traveled world. The diversity of backgrounds from which the authors of these accounts came, their different religions, nationalities, and occupations, played an important part in determining the way in which they individually sought to understand or represent sati. The media through which these travelers reported their findings or experiences also influenced the way in which they dealt with their subject matter. Some, like the Englishman Ralph Fitch, who traveled in India in the late 16th century, restricted themselves to merely mentioning the existence of sati. Fitch simply commented that, quote, "When the husband dieth, his wife is burned with him. If she be alive, if she will not, her head is shaven, and then is never any account made of her after." End quote. Part of the reason for this brevity, this smallness or lack of explanation and elaboration, may be that many contemporary accounts, particularly by traders, were not written for publication. They were intended rather to provide information that could be used to further commercial interests. Let's check out the footnotes once again. It is not my intention in making this distinction between voluntary and involuntary sati to subscribe to any construction of good and bad. Thank God, like a good sociologist, or to undermine the violence to women contained in even a voluntary immolation. Right. Rather, this distinction is used to distinguish various European reactions to the rite as it was understood at the time. Fair enough. Okay. Moreover, many of the early travelers to South Asia were not literary men or even very well educated, and as Arnold Wright points out, it was often the quote unquote utilitarian rather than the romantic side of the tour that they aimed at presenting. They tended to stick to bare facts and, quote, refuse to treat a subject imaginatively even where they could conveniently do so, end quote. There were, of course, numerous exceptions to this rule, and it is within the corpus of more detailed accounts that we find emerging the varying strands of a discourse or discourses on sati that were at once both strikingly divergent and subliminally unified. The intrinsic interest that arises from the study of reactions to sati in this period is found in the quote unquote culture specific and individual patterns of perception that informed this diversity, and perhaps more importantly, in the location of areas of agreement. Saints and sinners, early modern reactions to sati. For the majority of European travelers who made their way to India after the discovery of the sea route by Vasco da Gama in 1498, knowledge of the religion of the Indies was primarily based on medieval constructions of pagan tribes and sects. The conception of Hinduism as a coherent religious system did not emerge until at least the 18th century. Rather, in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Gentus or Gentus were widely characterized as either followers of the Pythagorean doctrine of transmigration or descendants of the original Gentiles of the Old Testament. Their religion was for the most part dismissed as a disorienting assortment of pagan, quote unquote, pagan beliefs and rituals. Moreover, the so-called heathen religions were deemed to be diabolical in aspect. The medieval church had given pagan deities a real existence by designating them demons and minions of Satan. Yeah, so they believed in our gods more than Hindu atheists. Thus, when a religious context for sati was suggested, it was usually that of pagan barbarity, as an example of the way in which Satan deceived the credulous to their eternal damnation. Let's take some comments. The footnote. The term Hinduism was not generally used until the 19th century, though the conception of a quote-unquote religion of the Hindus emerged somewhat earlier. European understanding of this religion was to a great extent informed by the assumptions of the late 18th century Orientalists, whose quote-unquote textual imperialism constructed an image of Hinduism that quote-unquote bore little or no resemblance to the diversity of Indian religious belief and practice. See, beautiful, she's being so fair. And which eventually, quote, distorted and perhaps irretrievably transformed Indian religiosity in a westernized direction. Brilliant. What a brilliant woman. Richard King, Orientalism and Religion, Post-Colonial Theory, India and Mystic East. Okay. Is this a paper or a book, guys? Can you all just Google and let me know? I'll have to buy this book then. Unless if it's from Rutledge, it will probably cost 15,000 rupees, so I won't be able to buy it then. See also Geoffrey Oddy's book, Constructing Hinduism, the Impact of the Protestant Missionary Movement on Hindu Self-Understanding. Interesting. Guys, please note down these two things, okay? If they are books or papers, if they are papers, we'll have to discuss from live streams. And another one, Robert Frykenberg, Christians and Missionaries in India, Cross-Cultural Communication since 1500. It is the first to seem very interesting in how the idea of Hinduism as a religion was constructed. Partho Mitro, Much Maligned Monster, History of European Reactions to Indian Art. Are baap re, ye Partho Mittar kaun hai? Obviously, it's a Bengali. Written in 1977, Clarendon Press, Oxford. Who are these people? Holy shit. Check this work out also, guys. Google it, okay? Much Maligned Monster, History of European Reactions to Indian Art, written by Partho Mittar. Interesting. This is getting very fascinating. A lot of thoughts are getting triggered in my mind. Sorry for getting distracted. It's a very fascinating paper. So this infernal aspect of sati as a heathen rite is particularly well illustrated by the account of 16th century Italian traveler Ludovico de Varthema, who represented it as an act of human sacrifice to the idol Deumo. Ye kaun hai? He described the priests as men clothed like devils who carry fire in their mouths, and said that they also offer a sacrifice to Deumo, and the wife goes many times up and down that place, dancing with the other women. She goes many times to the men clothed like devils to entreat them and tell them to pray the Deumo that he will be pleased to accept her as his own. Do not imagine, however, that she is unwilling to do this. She even imagines that she will be carried forthwith into heaven. Devarthama's imagery is deeply embedded in the medieval iconography of pagan barbarity. The diabolical associations in this account are further emphasized by the fact that earlier in this narrative, Devarthama clearly conflated Deumo with the devil. Okay. For Devarthama, the Sati is deceived to her destruction by this diabolical deity. Devarthama himself was a lay traveler, but in his emphasis on the diabolical aspects of Sati, he echoes the attitudes most commonly found in early missionary accounts. Of course, it is hardly surprising that men concerned with the conversion of the pagan should highlight the more iniquitous local customs and blame them on religious belief. Fuck. Did you all just hear what she said? Andrea Major is saying this. Of course, it is hardly surprising that men concerned with the conversion of the pagan should highlight the more iniquitous local customs and blame them on religious belief, painting customs like Sati in their darkest hue. Damn. How to underline this? I have no clue how to underline on PDFs. Maybe someday I'll find out. Jesuit missionary Father Montserrat or Monserrate, for example, stressed the coercion sometimes involved in the rite, lamenting, quote, "If they hesitate, the wretched creatures are driven onto the pyre, and if they try to leap off again, are held down with poles and hooks," end quote. Yet even the ostensibly voluntary satis were held up to condemnation for the role supposedly played by the Hindu priesthood therein. In his China Illustrata of 1667, Athanasius Kircher spoke of an, quote, infernal troop of sacrificers who, rather than conducting her, the sati, to the Elysian fields, as they believe, led her into eternal flames to continue a never-ending torture there. End quote. So she's pointing out that when the sati is happening involuntarily, then they are blaming it on diabolical devil worship. When it's happening voluntarily, even then the missionaries are blaming it on diabolical devil worship. This image of a self-propelled descent into hell was reinforced by the iconography commonly employed to illustrate the early travelers' accounts. The title page of Abraham Rogers' La Porte Ouverte, 1670, showed a half-naked woman leaping into the flames of a funeral pyre while a demon overhead proclaimed the title of the book. Similarly, an engraving in Van Linschoten's Itinerario showed a scantily dressed woman jumping into a pit of fire. तो ये है gradual subtle messaging जो कि बहुत सालों से करने से किसी के दिमाग में घुस जाता है कि अच्छा तो therefore sati means this. Okay, let's read the footnote now. Antoine Monserrate, the commentary of Father Monserrate, J. Hoyland and S. Banerjee, Oxford University Press, 1922. Page 62, it says, Jesuit accounts of Indian society and customs reached the public in Europe in the form of letters sent by the missionaries to their patrons. As had been the case with Confucianism, the Jesuits tried to ease the path to conversion by allowing certain Hindu customs to be retained. These Malabar, quote-unquote, Malabar rites, interestingly, caused considerable controversy and forced the Jesuits into the anomalous situation of defending some aspects of Indian religion. Sati, however, did not fall into this category and was condemned either as murder or suicide. Okay. Quoted in Kate Telsher's India Inscribed European and British Writing on India, 1600 to 1800, New Delhi. For a similar depiction, see the French missionary, the Abbé Le Carré, quoted in that previous book. Okay. Let me check some comments now and I'll have some green tea a bit. Let's see where the comment section is going. B.R. Ambedkar criticizes Hinduism because he wants to convert Hindus to Christianity. And Indian does not convert to Christianity himself. What's your point? This is fascinating. Thank God I cancelled my Netflix subscription. Thomas Munro slammed the missionaries in Parliament for their activities and said, better focus on saving English people indulging in thievery alcoholism. I see. M. Shastri is saying, to underline text, use annotations. There should be a button menu option called annotations. Okay. Okay, then Nandish is saying, practices similar to sati that existed until 1950s, Fijian widow strangling, funeral sacrifices in China, Kurdish Jinwar ritual. I see. I think there's a more modern book that you should read, Modern Hinduism. Okay. Please comment on Daniel Gray's Creating the Problem Hindu, Sati, Thagi, and Female Infanticide in India. Interesting. Okay, I'll have to check these papers out. Okay. Uh, the earliest account of Sati was found in South India. No, in fact, in during Northwest India, Alexander's invasion. It was because of foreign activities after the invasion of region. Why don't they discuss what happened to widows who did not go under Sati in the Jananas? Yeah, that's not the factor because it was happening even before the invaders came in. So invaders always kept coming in, so it always probably went on. Thomas Munro, Lushington, Warren Hastings were always against missionaries. That's what I've heard. Yes, Brahmos, Aryas, Sikhs, Ambedkar all were creating a path for conversion to Abrahamic thought by rejecting Hinduism. Yes, but they themselves were, I guess, did not mean it that way because none of them did it. Okay. Brahmo Samaj broke up because Devendranath Thakur, Rabindranath's father, was such a staunch Hindu that he got fed up and pissed off with Keshav Chandra Sen, who was actually very inclined to Christianity. Then that what was his name? Who was the Christian converted to Christian, then came back. The Catholicism guy. Brahmabandhu Upadhyay came back to Hinduism. Madhusudan Datta came back to Hinduism. Ambedkar never even went to Christianity. In fact, the only religion he did convert to absolutely modified it and broke it up and reordered everything inside that religion to suit his personal beliefs, and basically ended up creating his own religion. So yes, these things are open to misinterpretation and therefore can cause people to, as today these people's arguments are being used to push people towards going out of Hinduism. That's true, but the people who said these things themselves never meant it that way, except maybe Keshav Chandra Sen himself. Okay, 51% cases of sati were done by Shudras. Okay, Meenakshi Jain book. Okay, but later on it was started by upper castes only. Shudra started doing it as a aspirational model thing, mimesis. Okay. So as a pagan, as a pagan and a suicide, as a pagan and a suicide, it would seem that the sati is irredeemable. Certainly, a strict Christian interpretation of her actions would condemn her utterly. However, the majority of early modern observers appear to have viewed her sacrifice in a quite different context. For the majority of lay observers, the rite was predicated not on religious error but on more temporal issues. This is not to suggest that they did not recognize a religious component in the rite, but rather that this remained peripheral to their understanding of its causes, at least until the second half of the 17th century. And I will argue that this is the case with each and every Hindu practice, that the religious justification, explanation, or any basically justification or explanation comes later on, after seeing something that's going on anyway or something that needs to be done. The Brahmins come and sanction that if they are asked to, in return for land grants or general favors and dakshina, etc. That okay, yes, I think we can interpret it in the context of religion as well, and therefore it should be done. I think that has always happened, and all of those things have remained peripheral. The reasons of any good thing or bad thing in Hindu society have always been basically sociological. I think not so, if not sociological, let's say societal, temporal reasons have always been the main cause behind every phenomenon in Hinduism, and therefore blaming Hinduism is actually very foolish. Even if you do find evil texts and stuff, they were always later justification. They were promotions. Like, let's say reason always pretends to be a steward of an action, right? But reason is in the end, for an individual level or on an institutional level, reason always comes, actually works, operates as a lawyer or a marketing agency, nothing more, nothing less. 17th century. For the most part, early modern observers focused instead on the societal forces acting on the widow. John Ovington attributed sati to the system of child marriage, which he saw as contributing to a marital bond so strong that it could survive even death. Others, such as Frenchman John Baptiste Tavernier, attributed the apparent willingness of satis to die to their desire to escape the punitive rigors of ascetic widowhood. That would be understandable. Also, although even if it is so, it would require insane amounts of social grooming, because the pain that one has to inflict upon themselves to gradually burned to death. Your skin peels off, pus comes out, then you go on screaming and screaming and screaming. Your lungs get burned down, your body organs are getting burned. I don't think that can happen just because you want to escape from ascetic widowhood. I think there's countless generations and layers of social grooming that require someone to convince themselves of doing it. Okay. Conversely, although religion was often identified as one of the factors involved in the rite, it was given nowhere near the importance it would be accorded in later centuries. Listen to this. Although religion was often identified as one of the factors involved in the rite, it was given nowhere near the importance it would be accorded in later centuries. Later centuries may British, because of their, let's say, vested interests, and stupid trads because of their stupidity, always on every factor conclude that whatever happened, it had religious basis and therefore actually needs to be done, or as from the perspective of commies and British, and therefore blame Hinduism. Rather, it was seen as just one of a myriad of motivations. This strikingly contrasts with the 19th century constructions, in which the widow's agency, and for those of you who are, let's say, outsiders to lingo of social science, agency in this case does not mean and sort of an ad agency or an office. Agency in this case means the personal consent, free will of the widow. Okay, so in which the widow's agency was often subsumed in abstract considerations of the religious nature of the rite. Perhaps the most simplistic of the early explanations for the practice, but the one which received the most support, was that which attributed it solely to the sati's devotion to her husband. The Dutch factor Francisco Pelsaert, on witnessing a sati, commented, "Surely this is as great a love as the women of our country bear their husbands, for the deed was done not under compulsion, but out of sheer love." End quote. Similarly, the Italian humanist and traveler Pietro della Valle, on seeing a potential sati parading through the streets, declared, quote, "If I can find out when it will be, I will not fail to go and see her, and by my presence honor her funeral with that compassionate affection which so great conjugal fidelity and love seem to me to deserve." End quote. Arguably, it is this conception of the sati as actuated by fidelity that mainly redeems her in the eyes of European observers from the logical consequences of her suicide. But how, nevertheless, did these observers get around the awkward ideological issue of suicide? Kate Teltscher has suggested that the European literary tradition that allowed classical or pagan suicide to be considered outside the framework of Christian morality allowed satis to be represented as tragic heroines, and there is certainly a great deal of merit in this argument. Yet I would suggest that the real basis for the sati's redemption lay in the ideological space created when patriarchal ideas about femininity intersected with Christian morality. Brilliant. What redeemed the act of sati for these early Europeans was the perception that it was motivated by the love of the victims for their dead husbands and by their worthy desire to remain chaste. After all, the Christian tradition itself urged compassion towards women who killed themselves rather than face dishonor. Even the intractable Saint Augustine, asking rhetorically, quote, "Who so lacks human sympathy as to refuse to pardon them?" End quote. Ultimately, Christian abhorrence of suicide as a mortal sin was tempered by patriarchal notions about female chastity, and they got mingled up and created the justifications and considered it a religious justification. To fully understand the importance of the ideal of feminine chastity or fidelity in informing the European response to sati, though, it is useful to consider the contemporary European view of widowhood. Okay, which in its fundamental principles was not so far removed from Hindu ideas on the subject, although the concept of actually burning widows on the death of their husbands was certainly alien to Europeans, who thought it far more sporting to burn women for being witches. See, she is being fair. You can't blame Andrea Major for being a Orientalist, Western evil scholar, right? she's absolutely making fun of the European perspective. She's saying, yeah, they did not burn widows, but they thought it far more justifiable to burn them for being witches. Some of the assumptions and ideas that formed the rationale for sati were common to both cultures. While the European widow did not undergo the physical deprivations and indignities inflicted on her Hindu counterpart, the idea that after the death of a husband, a wife should retire to live a chaste and quiet life dedicated to the welfare of her children and the contemplation of God had a wide currency. In the English Gentlewoman of 1631, Richard Braithwaite wrote, quote, "Are you widows? You deserve much honor if you be so indeed. Great difference is there between those widows who live alone and retire themselves from public concourse and those who frequent the company of men. For a widow to love society gives speedy wings to spreading infamy, for in such because in such meetings she exposeth her honor to danger, which above all things she ought to incomparably tender. In popular concourse and court resorts, there is no place for widows." End quote. Look how fair Andrea Major is, that she takes the time out in the middle of a paper discussing sati to show how Christians and Europeans were also at fault. The reality, of course, was somewhat different, especially in London, where the widow was automatically entitled to one-third of her deceased husband's estate. In these situations, the wealthy widow often enjoyed a lifestyle and independence that few other circumstances would have afforded her. But while high mortality rates and a low life expectancy made remarriage for both sexes far from uncommon, even then, widow remarriage was generally stigmatized. Referring to the remarriage of the, and incidentally, I have been while arguing with a commie friend of mine, I've been repeatedly asked to answer on the blame that's also forced on Hinduism, that why are Hindu widows sent off to Kashi, Varanasi, etc. Okay, and we can see that not only can't that be blamed on Hinduism, but more so they also had sociological factors, obviously, but it was also fucking happening in Europe as well. But she did not know it. She also studied sociology, and she has not been taught these things. Referring to the remarriage of the Countess of Sunderland in 1652, her friend Dorothy Osborne commented, quote, "She lost by it much of the repute she had gained by keeping herself a widow." So you see, kind of status goes down if you remarry. Still, the desirability of chastity and fidelity to the memory of the deceased husband would certainly have been a familiar concept to European observers of this time. By her fulfillment of this ideal in the most ultimate sense, the Indian sati acquired a kind of iconic status in European thought. Too much forced, degrees of coercion. Okay, let's see. Let me have some green tea now and check a bit of comments now. In a lot of accounts of British officers, Meenakshi Jain's book, The Family Members Tried to Stop the Woman. Yeah, even I've read in countless Maratha kings' cases as well. The most famous case being Rani Ahalyabai herself. What do Christian texts say about widows? If they remain widows, then of course she deserves much honor and stuff. Which burning is more cruelty? No, if it's being done forcibly, then both are equally cruel. Let me check some comments. The 4 stages of subversion according to Yuri Bezmena. Yeah. Yes. And which is why I'm wondering, I'm beginning to realize that actually blaming Bengalis for all the things as a race is not going to be fruitful, because then demoralization, destabilization, normalization takes place, and the demoralization part is going to be too problematic. The other parts are not going to happen. Bhupendra Singh, I am binge watching your content. I can say it's worth weight in gold. Thank you. Malgudi Days are directed by Shankar Nag and was shot in. Okay. Thoda dekha tha. Okay. Those casteist Brahmins were the real men of Hinduism. Yes, and Mickey Mouse was killed by Batman. Dada, have you watched Malgudi Days? No, I'm too young for that, because by the time I began to watch TV a lot more than cartoons. It was already too backdated for me, and I only remember the music. And although I've been to the place where I think it was shot in or based on, okay, in Pune. To raise high funding, they magnified the problem, coming up with insanely high numbers. Probably the burning of skin and rest happens later. Okay, we are discussing the actual burning. Let's see. Where is Nina's previous comment? Okay. Anyway, so let's get back to the paper now. If you listen to Ideological Subversion of Mass Psyche lecture by I've listened to that. He talks about it. Yeah, I've listened to it. Bharata made a podcast on scientific basis of Hindu caste system. Okay, so why is it a Hindu caste system if it happened everywhere? It's not scientific; it's inevitable. I mean, yeah. Therefore, you could say it's scientific. Probably, you can read the book Swami and Friends. I haven't seen that series myself. If you listen to the ideological subversion, destroy, ridicule, replace with fake sects. Yeah. Okay. So yes, they did create fake sects and stuff. They probably highlight and propped up fake sects and created fake representatives. But whatever evidence we have, they are real as well. So let's see. Too much forced degrees of coercion. The image of the sati as a purely voluntary expression of devotion was, of course, a romantic and oversimplified representation, and that even an apparently voluntary sati might be subject to insidious forms of pressure, obviously, was recognized by the majority of observers of this period. In a letter to his friend Mario Shiparo, written in 1623, Delaval commented, "'Tis possible too that many widows, being in the height of their passion, taken at their word by their kindred who desire it, go to it afterwards with an ill will, not daring to deny those who exhort them thereunto, things which amongst women, through their natural fearfulness and modesty, easily happen." End quote. For Delaval, it was the inherent nature of femininity that made women susceptible to outside pressure and negated their ability to exercise free will in the face of societal pressure. Yet, for all of these dubious assumptions about female frailty, Delaval here showed an unusual flash of insight into the dynamics of a decision to commit sati that might have appeared wholly voluntary on the surface. The influence of societal pressure is also recognized in the explanation that the sati acts as she does to achieve honor for herself and her family. William Hawkins, who traveled in India on behalf of the English East India Company between 1608 and 1613, stated that at their burning, many of their wives will burn with them, because they will be registered in their books for famous and most modest and loving wives, who, leaving all worldly affairs, content themselves to live no longer than their husbands. For Hawkins, the sati's choice remained voluntary, a deed decided upon solely with a view to accruing merit. Particularly interesting here is the humanization of the sati's motives, which is an emphasis solely on the conjugal fidelity of the sati. Could see her constructed as a selfless, almost saintly figure. In Hawkins's account of self-interest returns to the equation. The suggestion is that some satis might have been, in fact, something less than the quote unquote most modest and loving wives, but nonetheless wished to be remembered as such. Interesting. A desire for honor did not necessarily render a sati's decision purely voluntary, however. For the famous French traveler Francois Bernier, who spent 12 years in India between 1656 and 1668, the function of honor is inverted. Rather than seeking her own glorification, the sati is blackmailed by the threat of honor withheld. Right. Unless you do it, honor won't come to you. Yeah. It's not like she's getting any extra honor. He tells us, quote, "I soon found that this abominable practice is the effect of early and deeply rooted prejudices. Every girl is taught by her mother that it is virtuous and laudable in a wife to mingle her ashes with those of her husband, and that no woman of honor will refuse compliance with the established custom." Yeah, obviously, this seems most plausible, because without the uh, without lifelong grooming, this can't happen. You can't kill yourself in that painful manner. For Bernier, the typical sati did not freely choose a course that would bring her merit, but was conditioned to believe that it was the only course that would avoid demerit. Yeah, I think I agree with this one most. My opinion is that this is absolutely correct. European recognition of the social consequences for not performing sati created a space for a consideration of the forms of coercion acting on the widow. This is not to suggest that there was a coherent or unified consensus on the nature of societal coercion in this period, of course. Again, she's being very fair, and she's absolutely right here, because nothing good or bad, no phenomena in the history of Hinduism or India can be said to be uniform in the same degree all across the country. The accounts of many early modern travelers suggest that they did not consider societal pressure and free action to be mutually exclusive. We repeatedly find tension between, and Rene Girard would agree here. We repeatedly find tension between admiration for the bravery and fidelity of the satis, juxtaposed against implicit recognition of the pressure Indian women were under to perform the rite, creating a telling tension in the literature of the period. Even de Laval, who so admired what he saw as the typical Sati's sense of devotion, was also concerned that her act might be, quote, too much forced in reality, end quote. Likewise, the comments of 17th century German traveler Albert de Mandelsloh specifically ascribed free choice to the practice of sati, but in the same sentence touched on the very circumstance that negated the idea of pure volition. Quote, this obligation of dying with their husband was imposed only on those women who stood upon a reputation of honesty. They were engaged thereto only by a principle of honor, there not being any punishment to be inflicted on such as refused, other than that they were not admitted to the company of persons of quality, as being looked on as infamous women. End quote. Mandelsloh here devalues the punitive nature of dishonor, reducing the severity of its dictates in the eyes of its readers, in the eyes of his readers by his casual reference to it. Seemingly, he was able in his own mind to reconcile freedom of choice with punishment for non-compliance. For others, the social pressure that forced the widow to the pyre was not so easily disregarded. The dramatic foil to the heroic sati, what a sentence! The dramatic foil to the heroic sati was the ascetic widow who, having failed to comply with expectations, was despised for her failure and marked out by physical signs. John Fryer tells us, quote, those who have buried their husbands, or rather burned them, are rifled of all their jewels and shaved, always wearing a red lungi, whereby to be known that they have not undergone the conflagration, for which cause they are despised and live more uncomfortably than the meanest servant. Yeah. So that is how actually uh, burning yourself becomes incentivized, or let's say at least not burning yourself gets disincentivized, by showing that those of you who don't burn themselves will live a very, very tough life. The suggestion here is that sati is the normative action of a widow, and that ascetic widowhood is a punishment for non-conformance. What the fuck is going on today? The suggestion here is that sati is the normative action of a widow, and that ascetic widowhood is a punishment for non-conformance. Right, the Kashi thing. The 16th century Portuguese traveler Duarte Barbosa made this idea explicit when he wrote, quote, all perform this in general, and if any women do not choose to do this, their relations take them, shave their heads, and turn them out of their houses and families in disgrace. Yeah. So the argument here would be, therefore, that if at all sati was not being done, as has been argued by some scholars, that yeah, the numbers were not too much, but those of whom did not do sati, were they being sent to those vidva ashrams kind of things in Kashi or not, or equivalent places? Therefore, low numbers of sati might not be the only justification. Okay, if it was a bad thing, it was a bad thing, and if it was being done in less numbers, it was still a bad thing. And especially if those bad things, not doing that bad thing, led them to a life of let's say bad treatment, and so they wandered through the world as lost ones. By echoing terminology, quote unquote, lost ones, usually used in reference to suicides, Barbosa makes a number of interlocking suggestions. He removes the widow from the interactive world of the living and places her within a purgatory of a living death, thus implicitly recognizing the negation of the self that is inherent in ascetic widowhood. See, this is why Adam Smith was actually so right, that a third person perspective who actually does not have vested interests might be a great person to study or write or do scholarships on a particular society, because Andrea Major, he is not trying to justify sati, nor is she trying to defend Hinduism or India. She's just looking at what it was, and therefore she comes up with a very important point, I think, that if at all somebody was not having to do sati, they were having a bad life anyway, and that is a pretty much a known fact. And here I think some scholars won't be that useful in arguing this case, especially with people who know both these sides and actually have a vested interest against India and Hinduism, and want to argue against Hinduism. They know both sides of the thing, and there you might be left weaponless if you know just the defense of it, the unconditional defense of it, that no, I will defend this at any cost. Moreover, he accurately pinpoints the Hobson's choice customarily presented to the Indian widow: physical death or a living death involving social and ritual damnation. Very important. Many European observers accepted a construction of sati that represented it as a normative action and ascetic widowhood as a punishment for non-compliance, even though most recognized that only a minority of Hindu women actually perform sati. तो ये देखो, इसके लिए मुझे मीनाक्षी जैन का बुक तो पढ़ना नहीं पड़ रहा है. Brilliant. This in itself is perhaps indicative of an attitude to women. Guys, remember this. If tomorrow you become a social scientist and you actually care about your credentials and you work in a place which is credentialed, which is respected in social science academia, you can quote this author from this paper where she says most recognize that only a minority of Hindu women actually perform the sati. Great. This is why we must read these papers. This in itself is perhaps indicative of an attitude to women that constructed their virtue primarily in terms of their relationship to men. If a widow, and that's understandable, of course, because back then men had more responsibility in society, those justifications aside, what was the reality of it? That is my concern at the moment. If a widow chose sati to escape an intolerable life, she cannot have committed the act out of love for her husband. Of course, it suited 17th century patriarchal European pride to consider women's actions as based on fidelity to men. And in that context, the hardship of ascetic widowhood is easily seen as a punishment for failure to live up to this standard. Not all observers of this period viewed ascetic widowhood as punitive, however. Interesting. She's bringing out all different kinds of perspectives. A few indeed chose to view the rigors of widowhood as the cause rather than the effect of sati. Tavernier, for example, wrote, quote, "The wife can never marry again, and all the rest of her life she lives slighted and despised, and in a worse condition than a slave in the very house where she was mistress before. This unfortunate condition makes them hate life so that they rather choose to be burned alive with the body of their deceased husband than live in the scorn and contempt of the world." For Tavernier, the indignities inflicted on Indian widows created an environment in which death might well be a rational choice. Although he stopped short of identifying this with a removal of choice, Tavernier here comes remarkably close to the modern feminist position on sati. Indeed, in emphasizing the importance of ascetic widowhood, whether in a punitive or causative role, the observers of this period showed a remarkably keen awareness of the sociological aspects of sati, one that would be submerged in the 18th and early 19th century by the rhetoric of religion. Religion. This twinning of apparent free agency and implied coercion features in many of the early accounts of sati. Brilliant paper. Concerned with the widow as the central factor in the drama of sati created space in this period for a much clearer and less cluttered appreciation of the human motivations at work than was possible in the early 19th century, when concern over sati was shifted into the public realm and the experience of the individual became submerged in a legalistic reinterpretation of the rite itself. Indeed, in its basic form, this concern with the status of the widow who did not commit sati foreshadows late 19th century feminist arguments and remains an important aspect of the feminist debate on sati today. In the 16th and 17th centuries, however, the austerities imposed upon the widow were not conceived to totally negate the possibility of free will in the widow's choice as they were in later feminist constructions, but seen rather as coexisting in an uneasy relationship, the dynamics of which provoked some differing interpretations. Great. Next subchapter begins. Chastity ensuring death, sati and sexuality. Okay, let me have some green tea and check some comments again. Fascinating paper. Because, okay, I'll get to that later. Meenakshi Jain would add to Andrea Major. Why or how? What is the central Meenakshi Jain argument? That Sati's the Sati incidents were over propped up, right? Or overhyped, and that the numbers were in fact less. She has already said this, or she just said this in the paper only. What other things has Meenakshi Jain argued? I have no idea. All I know is that she has argued that case that sati was not that common very, very effectively with lots of academic rigor. That's what I know. But that seems to be the central point, that it did not happen all that much. William Bentinck was not even in India for 18 months while passing off act. There were many Smritis like Yagyavalkha, Parashar, okay, which sanctioned widow remarriage. Interesting. So you see, why did then these things did not take place? Because in the end, Hindus, or actually no society, really follows their religious texts unless they have an incentive to do so. तो यहाँ पे इंसेंटिव स्ट्रक्चर कुछ और बन गया था. पावर स्ट्रक्चर्स ने कहा कि ये स्मृति का ये चीज फॉलो नहीं करना है. मे बी दे saw some benefits. I have not thought about it that hard. Although everything that can be claimed to be patriarchal today probably had some sort of justification, because the men had more say, because the men were doing most of the things, because it was a world where physical might was everything. So it may have been okay for that period, but even in a period where it was okay, why were these smritis then were talking about or sanctioning widow remarriage? So obviously, in some places, some kings, some Brahmins under some kings were writing these texts, and they were sanctioning it because that's what the king decided, or the incentive structures turned out to be like that in that particular society where it was being written. But it was not commonplace because some other incentive structure came to place, which is why religiosity can't be the measure of anything in society except incentive structure, except I guess actually not except anything, because most things happen because of incentives. Let's say the religiosity, piousness, unity of Muslims in India would not happen unless our state incentivized them to do these things. If the state hypothetically tomorrow stops the Hajj payments, or the Hajj Yatra monetary donations that they give, or the Waqf board, or the madrasa fundings, I guarantee you Muslim unity would not be there, or the piousness or the devoutness that Muslims have today in their community would not exist. It exists because of state incentives. It does not exist among Hindus because of the lack of state incentives. Which is why I'm going on arguing that Hindutva cannot be dependent on religiosity or Hinduism, and Hinduism can't be a requisite for Hindutva, because most Hindus today even have no fucking clue about Hindutva. Most of them don't even agree about Hindutva, and the biggest proponents of Hindutva were not that big. It's not. You could accuse me of appeal to authority here, but let's say Sitaram Goel, Veer Savarkar were not great theologians and stuff, although they found some value in it. I'm going one step further. I'm saying it does not even matter whether the texts are great or not. It does not matter if Manusmriti recommends puppy torture or not. It does not matter if you've read Ramayana or not, because the main reason for Hindutva is survival of Hindus, right? And who are we facing the threat from? Why is the issue of survival coming up? We are facing an issue of survival because of people who won't care whether you as a Hindu eat beef or not, or whether you know Ramayana by heart or not, or whether you are religious or not, or whether you are a Hindu Nirishwarvadik, Nastik, Astik or not. They are going to kill you just because of your Hindu name. Therefore, your justifications of the survival, and which I would argue is absolutely, that is Hindutva, that need not also be based on religion, because the religion being good or bad has no relation to my right to survive as a Hindu. Okay, let me check some comments. I'm traveling to Bengaluru on 20. Okay, okay. So let's continue with the paper then. Chastity ensuring death, Sati and sexuality. The themes of honor and dishonor were, of course, founded on a patriarchal construction of society that saw women's lives as subsumed in those of their husbands, obviously. Honor was attained by fidelity to husbands, even in death. Yeah. Not surprisingly, Europeans latched on to the double standard that allowed the husband freedom to remarry while denying it to the wife, as an explanation for the practice of sati. Yet this double standard was rarely condemned per se. Rather, European commentary focused on the degree of severity with which the rule was applied, and the practical and moral outcome of a surplus of unmarried females. English merchant William Methold, for example, opined, quote, "If the husband dieth, the wife may not marry again. ये क्या spelling है भाई? Again, and back a few paragraphs ago, some old quote was pronouncing she as, meaning she as a woman, as SHEE. So not Mary again, and which is most unreasonable. Not the young ones, though never known of man, who happening to be widows in their infancy, must not only continue so, but be made the drudge to the whole family. And this, with most of them, together with a reverend respect they bear to the reputation of their house, mortifies them after a strange manner. Yet Yet some it cannot contain, but they fly out and forsaking their father's house, branded with a lasting obloquy by their loser lives. Yeah, I get it. And just to add another point to what I was just saying, that look at why commies win, why commies have won, not just CPIM, the idea of leftist politics in general. Okay, all these fuckers hate India, Hinduism. They deliberately hate Hinduism because they blame all these on Hinduism as a religion, नॉट एज अ पर्सनल कनेक्शन टू गॉड. तब रिलीजन इज अ पर्सनल मैटर सिर्फ आता है जब उनको गाली पड़ती है. हिंदुइज्म के मामले में एक तो है हिंदू, देयर इज नो सच थिंग कॉल्ड हिंदू. हिंदू कोई हिंदू है ही नहीं. वी आर डिफरेंट कास्ट, डिफरेंट ट्राइब्स एंड जातिज अपेरेंटली, बट एट द सेम टाइम हिंदूज आर अ मेजॉरिटी, एंड एट द सेम टाइम हिंदुइज्म इज सो स्ट्रॉन्ग अ रिलीजन दैट एवरीवन बिकेम इविल बिकॉज ऑफ दैट रिलीजन. तो हर ओर से आर्ग्यूमेंट आ गया है. But they never made the point that in order to be in their fucking leftist team, you have to be irreligious. That was just a fucking eyewash. No commie party worker, I mean, most commie party workers, most Congress party workers who have actively taken part in anti-Hindu laws have never been non-practitioners themselves, which is why they have won. That is what I'm arguing. They have won because they have not, let's say, ostracized, or they have not kept away people who want to be religious in their personal lives. In the same way, we in the Hindutva movement, and especially let's say in the Hindutva 2.0 movement, cannot alienate non-religious people at fucking all. Bhupendra is saying, what is your opinion on role of RSS in protecting Hindus? Do we need more organizations like RSS to safeguard Hindus? The role of RSS in protecting Hindus has happened in some places, hasn't happened in some places. So we keep hearing that they have done fascinating groundwork in the Northeast, which is why BJP is in power today. Although Northeast always votes according to whoever is in center. Moreover, Bengal, which pretty much has a devout Bengali Hindu almost in every household, their RSS has not been able to convince them, with even with their groundwork, of the need for a Hindu unity or the threats to Hinduism. So their groundwork has failed there, nor have they protected. Then Bajrang Dal, VHP, they are known to protect. VHP has been kind of, I keep hearing that they have been, their wings have been chopped down by Narendra Modi himself. Bajrang Dal, we have grown up knowing that their biggest achievement is beating up people going on dates, or beating up people in pubs and stuff. So instead of protecting Bengali refugees or Hindus here and there, or protecting Kashmiri Pandits, trying to let's say even reinstate their position inside Kashmir, or protecting them when the violence was going on, all they did was beat up Valentine's Day Hindu couples who would marry and have sex and give birth to Hindu babies. Okay, let's continue now. So Methold here picks up upon the important issue of the widow's sexuality and how to control it. He recognizes that the rationale behind the austerities imposed on the widow was to contain her and prevent her bringing shame on her family by forming a second marital alliance. Again, the capricious nature of female sexuality was an idea shared by both cultures. The image of the lusty widow was a stock stereotype in European culture. See, this scholar is being so fair. The image of the lusty widow was a stock stereotype in European culture, and it was the concern that widows were behaving in an unseemly manner that prompted Richard Braithwaite to advise against their frequenting court resorts. Similarly, Della Valle, or Val, echoed Methold's concern with the morality of Indian widows when he referred to the ban on widow remarriage as, quote, a very hard law indeed, and from which infinite inconveniences arise. For not a few young widows who, in regard of their reputation, cannot marry again, and who have not the patience to live chastely, commit disorders in private, especially with men of other nations and religions, and with any they find, provided it be secret. Yeah, because if you have become a widow at fucking 15 and you are horny all the time, how long are you going to live in a chaste, saintly life? You are then going to break those useless laws and fuck people in private, and that leads to, actually, I think, more social instability, because that breaking of a law mindset will have second order, third order consequences for both people in that action, which is why useless laws that, in fact, are too far removed from society always create these useless butterfly effects. It goes on incentivizing illegal behavior. I don't think there is any Indian who's never broken any law, right? Because of the number of laws we have and the kinds of weird laws we have. But every law breaking is only a gateway, because after that, the more powerful you get, and let's say the more evil you have in your heart because of your probably upbringing, or just the general nature of people you grew up with, the more power or money you get, you become a bigger of a lawbreaker, and a bigger of a lawbreaker, and a bigger of a lawbreaker. While the stupid anti-libertarian fuckers will go on creating more laws and more laws and more laws to keep the society in check. Being women, widows were not expected to be able to maintain their chastity for long, and so remained a constant threat. As John Fryer remarked, quote, "In the husband's flames, the wife offers herself a sacrifice to his manes, or else she shaves her head and turns whore for her livelihood, none of her friends looking upon her." End quote. Great. The sati then represented one possible moral extreme. The widow turned whore, the other. Indeed, Telscher has suggested that the sati is the only European representation of Indian womanhood in the early modern period that does not emphasize sexuality. I would argue, however, that coercion with the chastity or lack thereof of the widow reintroduces the issue of sex into the discussion of sati. I think she's absolutely fair for doing that. I think she's absolutely right here. The immolated wife may be the ultimate expression of fidelity, right? But the image of the unchaste widow makes it clear that this fidelity is achieved only through the physical negation of natural sexuality. Absolutely, yes. And therefore, she kind of becomes the scapegoat of the society as well. As Lucy Hughes Halle points out, for European men of this period, quote, "the only good woman is a chaste woman, and the only chaste woman is a dead one." Holy shit, that's dark stuff. The issue of woman's destructive sexuality is raised again in the often repeated tale of the sati's supposed origins told by the classical Greek geographer Strabo, who claimed that the practice was derived from an ancient legal enactment to curb the penchant of Indian wives for poisoning their husbands. This account, which achieved almost universal acceptance among European writers of the 16th and 17th centuries, paints sati primarily in secular terms as an issue of crime and punishment mutated into tradition. Absolutely. I mean, this explanation might not be right, but this phrase is absolutely right, that this is always what happens in society. It's an issue of crime and punishment that mutates into tradition. The widespread acceptance of this quiet, unlikely story of the origins of sati requires more explanation, particularly given its blatant misogynism. To accept the story is to accept that women, or at least Indian women, are inherently wicked and licentious. But this assumption would not have been totally repugnant to Europeans of the time. The 17th century saw considerable debate in Europe about the nature of femininity between those who wanted to posit a more flattering view of the female sex and those who were determined to defend the long-standing constructions of women as vessels of sin, who derived their rationale from the biblical story of Eve and the fall from Eden, and from Pauline assertions of female inferiority. The image of the virtuous sati dying for the love of her husband could be uncomfortable to those who subscribe to the latter view. Conversely, the notion that her fiery end was the result not of her inherent goodness but of her inherent vice could be reassuring. Thus, Thomas Herbert referred to sati as, quote, "a just revenge for their former too much abused liberty, grown so audaciously impudent that upon the least distaste Nothing but the harmless lives of their too much loving husbands could satiate their lustful boldness procured by poison, till by Parliament this course was taken to burn their wives with their dead bodies to secure themselves from future dangers. Herbert's inversion of the ideal of the pure and virtuous sati constructs the rite as an emblem for for female incontinence. In this ultimately misogynistic interpretation, the roles of oppressor and oppressed are inverted. The Hindu female becomes the perpetrator of violence, while the quote unquote too much loving husbands are portrayed as passive victims. In today's gender conscious environment, and with the experience of 400 years of writing on sati that would serve to effectively turn this consideration on its head, it seems incredible that such an explanation should have been either tendered or believed. To the English observer of the period, though, it must have had a certain familiarity. The English law of that period held a husband's power over his wife to be almost feudal in nature, and the wife who murdered her husband, like the servant who turned on his master, was deemed guilty of treason and liable to the death penalty. As Teltscher puts it, quote, the belief in sati as a penalty for husband murdering is a satisfying interpretation for the European mind. Brilliant. See how she is blaming the European explanation of sati. Incredible. The belief in sati as a penalty for husband murdering is a satisfying interpretation for the European mind because it explains a disturbing rite in familiar terms of crime and punishment and coincides with the Christian sense of the sinfulness of women. What a fucking brilliant paper. Next subchapter is called Innate Essences, Changing Interpretations of Sati in the 18th Century. Let me check some comments again. Namaskar Abhay. Check from the beginning, okay? We discussed some insane fun stuff. Because murder and suicide are already illegal, this was done to just to create a narrative of Hindu misogyny and patriarchy. Abhay, actually no, you'll have to listen. You make a very interesting point, and actually that's a correct point, but it's not based on correct facts in this case. It's correct on many other cases because we have found some interesting stuff. Okay, interesting nuances to discuss. So check from the beginning, because some were being pushed into them and some were doing it out of their own accord. Now the concern that this scholar starts out with is that, which is actually a fact, that many British people were not concerning themselves with even the coerced actions of sati because they thought they are probably meddling with Hinduism as a whole, although it started out with not getting attached to Hinduism. It's almost the English consciousness needed reassurance for subverting so many people. Yeah. Okay. Let's continue now. So, innate essences, changing interpretations of sati in the 18th century. The 18th century saw a significant change in the way sati was reported and interpreted. Although individual travel accounts on India continued to appear in large numbers, these personal accounts were increasingly supplemented by works of synthesis that sought to give a comprehensive picture of India, its peoples, and their institutions, clearly a broader task than the mere recitation of personal experience. As an early form of anthropology, it was not merely new, of course. It was in many respects the offspring of the geographies and cosmologies of earlier eras. But the Enlightenment fixation with scientific method in search for universal truths gave it a new impetus and direction. Interesting. Specifically, the trend towards, she's saying the Enlightenment fixation, okay? Specifically, the trend towards classifying and cataloging customs meant that some authors began to explain sati less in terms of what they or others had seen, but rather in terms of how the act conformed to the picture of India and Indians that was by this time consolidating in the European imagination. What a subtle and nuanced point to make. Okay, listen to this sentence again. Brilliant. Specifically, the trend towards classifying and cataloging customs meant that, first of all, classifying and cataloging is going to end up meaning codifying into law what might have been an organic and ever evolving custom. तो वहां पे तो एक स्टेप का प्रॉब्लम शुरू हो ही गया. But then moving on, trends towards classifying and cataloging customs meant that some authors began to explain sati less in terms of what they or others had seen, but rather in terms of how the act conformed to the picture of India and Indians that was by this time consolidating in the European imagination. The Enlightenment, concerned with method and with universal laws, was in part responsible for the shift in critical focus away from the individual widow as an autonomous agent in the decision making process. Rather than see her actions in their specific social context, 18th century writers preferred to insert her into a broader scheme aimed at explaining the nature of Indian society and religion. Now the Haramipanti begins. The rebranding of Sati begins. Continents and peoples were believed to have certain qualities and characteristics that defined them in relation to others. These qualities were seen to be the result of climate, fair enough, forms of government, and so on, and were considered to constitute the immutable essence of a race. The disgrace and discomfort of the widow who survived her husband was still occasionally alluded to, but for the most part, that these considerations became subsumed in an 18th century rhetoric about the nature of India and its people and religion. Increasingly, the sati was portrayed not as an agent in a rational or even irrational decision making process, but because it was in her nature to act that way. Rather than seek for the sociological causes of sati, 18th century observers increasingly explained it in terms of two supposedly defining characters of widowhood, which is inherent religiosity and unfailing fidelity, both of which seems absolute horseshit to me. A sacred dearness, sati, and conjugal fidelity. Although it did not disappear entirely, the quote unquote poisoning explanation was increasingly rejected because it sat uneasily with these perceptions. John Henry Groves, or what did she say? Although it did not disappear entirely, the poisoning, okay, the husband poisoning thing, okay. Explanation was increasingly rejected because it sat uneasily with these perceptions. Uneasily with which perceptions? The perceptions of inherent religiosity or unfailing fidelity. तो वहां पे अब हम हस्बैंड पॉइजनिंग कैसे घुसाए? जॉन हेनरी ग्रोज तो खुद का बनाया हुआ गड्ढे में खुद गिर रहा है. John Henry Groves, for example, considered the notion to be, quote, an over refinement of conjecture, as false as it is injurious to the women of this country, no such practice being either attested by creditable tradition or warranted by the behavior of the other Indian women not subject to this custom, and who are generally of a mold of mind so soft and tender to incur even the suspicion of such a detestable barbarity. Actually, then a great question comes up. Then what? If it is not husband poisoning, if it is not insane amounts of religiosity, if it is not love for the husband, then what is it? Indeed, for many 18th century observers, the very virtue that for Groves made them incapable of murdering their husbands was sufficient in itself to explain the practice of immolation. Pierre Sonnerat commented that, quote, however extravagant and atrocious this custom may appear, it is easy to give a reason for it. The extreme love of some women for their husbands, the despair at their loss, and the desire to follow them was the first cause of this sacrifice, which custom authorized and time made universal. And I disagree with this because this is kind of an hedonist view of a society, or just sort of a soft bigotry of low expectations on our ancestors, that they were so stupid, they were so naive that they thought this way. They just burned themselves alive out of love. No, not happening. The rationale behind the depiction of Indian women as totally devoted to their husbands is made up of several strands. To the extent that Hindu women, guys, Arthashastra was fucking written in 300 BC. Can we stop infantilizing our great ancestors? They were absolute as geniuses, as every bit as harami as us, okay? The rationale behind the depiction of Indian women as totally devoted to their husbands is made up of several strands. To the extent that Hindu women were increasingly becoming defined by the act itself, this stereotypical portrayal carried implications of conjugal fidelity. As Luke Crafton wrote, quote, no women are more remarkable for their conjugal fidelity, in which they are distinguished beyond the rest of their sex by that remarkable custom of burning with their husband, end quote. But in addition, changing ideas about the sati's sexuality can be correlated to changing ideas about femininity in the West. Scholarship on sati is going on evolving as the discussion about femininity is evolving in the West. Wow. The 18th century saw the resolution of the querelle de femme in favor of women being inherently virtuous rather than inherently vicious. This is not to suggest that 18th century thinkers accorded women equality, but rather that they viewed her as possessing her own particular excellences, among which were spirituality and morality. Changing medical understandings also redefined women as quote unquote perfect in themselves, rather than as imperfect men. Moreover, the shift away from Galenic medicine undermined the idea of women as inherently sexually driven, an assumption which had previously been based on the supposed craving of the female's cold, wet, quote unquote, cold, wet constitution for the cold, for the quote unquote dry heat of the male. Oh my god. The result was that women were increasingly constructed as sexually passive, physically and mentally the weaker or softer gender. हाँ भाई, सब के सब सबमिसिव है, तो कोई डोमिनेट्रिक्स नहीं है सोसाइटी में. In turn, the impact of these changing European attitudes to femininity were supplemented by culturally specific assumptions about Indian women that saw their conjugal fidelity as premised on the combined force of religious injunction and social conditioning. Okay, early marriage was viewed as contributing to a devotion springing from total dependence on the male, yeah, while religious dictates imposed dire punishments for infidelity. John Henry Groves, elaborating on this theme, opined, quote, another reason, too, for their prodigious affection and veneration for their husbands in their early marriage, after which the parties in the tenderness of that ductile age are brought up until that of consummation, in the constant inculcation to them of mutual dearness as a sacred point of religion. Yeah, that seems understandable and seems true. And the women especially entertain such a strong impression of this doctrine that, notwithstanding the influence of a climate far from favorable to chastity, instances of infidelity are at least as rare among them as in any people of the world besides. This makes sense. Groves here combines the idea of the influence of early marriage in encouraging bonds of conjugal affection with the idea that this affection is imposed on women as a religious duty. Earlier in this narrative, Groves offered a graphic example of the power of religious dictates in enforcing fidelity by recounting a story of a Brahmin woman who, having been abducted and raped by a Muslim, was told that she could not regain her caste or rejoin her husband, even though she was willing to receive her. Even though he was willing to receive her. अच्छा अच्छा, तो husband राजी है, उसका समाज राजी नहीं है. In despair, she agreed to be purified by having molten lead poured down her throat, that she might at least die in her caste. Groves went on. Whether this story be true or false, it is certain that it contains nothing but what the law of the Gentus renders probable, and as certain that an article of it annexing an expulsion from their communion to any violation of the conjugal faith. Wait. Remember this thing. Groves himself is saying that I don't know this is true or not, but this is, at least it might be argued that this is what was kind of what was going on. Okay. I'm saying even that might not be true, because who had the biggest megaphones in society back then, especially in relation to the British? Okay, it was mainly the Brahmins. So this story might have been projected by some Brahmin somewhere who told this story as a great act of purity, which probably had absolutely no basis in society. Highly possible. He just told this as a thing that he would like to have happened. And if you ask someone from another varna or a different jati, they would say a completely different story, probably also conjured up, or maybe based on societal facts. But it's a issue of who is trying to be a megaphone, who has a megaphone, who has the power of building narratives, who is close to power, who is close to the governments, and who is telling the story for whom, who is doing the marketing for whom. This story is doing the marketing for Brahmins who wanted to say that this is a great thing. Obviously, a Brahmin who told this story did not say this as a way of saying that, see, we are so evil that we do such evil things. I guarantee you, whoever said this story first to the British said this as a great thing, that shows our purity. But I'm saying this has probably nothing to do with reality. It has everything to do with power structures, their relationships, and megaphones. Okay, so Gross is saying, whether this story be true or false, it is certain that it contains nothing but what the law of the Gentus renders probable. And here I'm disagreeing, and I'm saying this is probably the laws of just the Brahmins, probably some jatis in among the Brahmin Varna, in some places probably. and as certain that an article of it annexing an expulsion from their communion to any violation of the conjugal faith. In short, the wives of the principal Gentus, with all their apparent freedom of showing themselves, are by their never going abroad unless accompanied by their superstition, as effectually defended from the approaches of strangers as those of the Moors are by their walls, bars, lattice windows, and impenetrable veils. The conjugal fidelity of Hindu women was thus interpreted as a joint product of social institutions and religious dictates. Now, specious pretexts, sati as a religious rite. Another subchapter. Let me have some green tea now. Divyamani Ramon Roy said what? By the way, he's saying while Europeans have spoiled our our specific Hindu religion, today in the 21st century, we all Hindus must unite and bring back our old traditions like sati pratha, casteism, and child marriage, etc. Yes, and Batman must avenge Robin's death by killing Mickey Mouse. Raja Ramon Roy is chilling in UK in his grave. Yeah, I heard another justification for that they did not have funeral pyre facilities. That's why he got buried there. Why everyone around the world is trying to convert Indians? Jealousy कि ये ancient civilization convert काहे नहीं किया भोसड़ी के. Indian dharma is dictated by what the Godas think. When we stop thinking what Godas say is when we return to de-liberalized dharma. I get your argument that dharma doesn't appeal though. Can't. Okay. ये pious flames तो पूरा बुक है. ऐसा क्या? कितने पेज का बुक है? Okay. The desire on the part of these मेरा ये पेपर तो 30 पेज का है. The desire on the part of these European authors to represent Hindu women's devotion to their husbands in terms of religious injunction is illustrative of the degree to which religion was increasingly seen in Europe as regulating all aspects of Hindu life. देखो, even personal emotive bonds, सब कुछ religion के आधार पे बेस्ड है. हाँ, सब एकदम सुबह से शाम मनुस्मृति पढ़ के स्टेप बाय स्टेप काम करते हैं, या फिर उससे कभी कोई डाइग्रेस नहीं करता है, कोई ट्रांसग्रेस नहीं करता है. हाँ, सिर्फ जो चीजें seemingly could be termed progressive today or could call for Hindu unity, सिर्फ वो नहीं फॉलो करते हैं. पिक एंड चूज करके कुछ चीजें करते हैं. So in the end, whether or not any of our actions were based on any text or scripture, it always came down to convenience and incentive structures. That is what I'm arguing. Because like Divyamani Tripathi was giving the example that so many texts have even sanctioned widow remarriage. कोई किसी भोसड़ी के ने फॉलो नहीं किया, क्यों? किसी ने फॉलो नहीं करने दिया, तो सैंक्शन किया है तो जाओ अब विडो मैरिज करो. बंगाल में तो ईश्वर चंद्र विद्यासागर तक वेट करना पड़ा, क्यों? तो even personal emotive bonds, although the majority, so even she's saying that why Europeans blamed sati on Hinduism is because they thought like their European society everything was based on religious on religious sanctions, even though it would not have been the case even in England. कहाँ पे incentive structures are in alignment with the religious sanctions, that only that predicates how much the society seems to be in alignment with the religious sanctions. Okay, so let's read this fascinating sentence once again. The desire on the part of these European authors to represent Hindu women's devotion to their husbands in terms of religious injunction is illustrative of the degree to which religion was increasingly seen in Europe as regulating all aspects of Hindu life, even personal emotive bonds. Although the majority of early modern observers had recognized that there was a certain degree of spiritual merit involved in sati, it was only toward the end of the 17th century that religion emerged as a fundamental constituent of the European understanding of the rite. Writing in 1676, Tavernier may be seen as a transitional commentator in this respect, since he still placed significant emphasis on the sociological motivations for sati. But Tavernier highlighted the role of the Brahmins and of religious belief. Quote, the Brahmins make them believe that in dying after that manner, they shall revive again with him in another world, with more honor and more advantages than they enjoyed before. These are the motives that persuade the women to burn with their husbands. Besides that, the priests flattered them with hope that while they are in the midst of the flames before they expire, Ram will appear and reveal wonderful visions to them, and that after their souls have transmigrated into various bodies, they shall at length obtain a high degree of honor to eternity. This makes sense. People probably believed in these things. Transmigration is commonly believed even today. But why only this thing said by a particular set of Brahmins? There, I think, lies the secret sauce of incentive structures and narratives, or convenience for the power structures. For Tavernier, the Sati's belief is clearly misguided, imposed upon her by the Brahmins, but he also recognized the power of its attraction. In this author's scheme of things, honor in this world and posthumous benefit in another were bribes held out to encourage the wavering soul. Francois Bernier also made much of what he perceived as the insidious influence of the priests. The clearest indication that he viewed sati as a religious rite comes not in this context, however, but in his discussion of the reluctance of India's Muslim rulers to outlaw the custom. Ye kya hai? The clearest indication that he viewed sati as a religious rite comes not in this context, however, but in his discussion of the reluctance of India's Muslim rulers to outlaw the custom. He noted that the Muslims, quote, do not indeed forbid it by a positive law because it is part of their policy to leave the idolatrous population, which is so much more numerous than their own, in the free exercise of their religion. ये तो कितना it was true in some contexts, for some times, in some regions, for some sections of time, but mostly not. Otherwise, the conversions would not happen. So we can now conclude that even Bernier was wrong about this judgment mainly. Bernier's assumptions here are remarkably akin to 19th century ideas on the subject and reflect the same concern that was later to impede British attempts to outlaw the custom, namely fear of provoking the majority population by attacking what was deemed to be their dearest institution, religion. अच्छा, जब खुद का कोई चुतिया खुद का कोई काम निकालना है, तब अचानक एकदम हिंदू मेजॉरिटी को फियर करना है, उनके रिलीजियोसिटी को फियर करना है. बाकी जब खुद का काम निकालना है at the cost of the Hindus, तब हिंदू तो डिसयूनाइटेड है, ये तो डिफरेंट नेशंस है, डिफरेंट कास्ट जातिज में बटे हुए है. So you see convenience and power structures. Similarly, the explanation that sati was part of a civic solution to wives murdering their husbands was increasingly conflated with religious injunction. Charles Dellon, writing in 1698, claimed that to give better color to this cruel decree, it was backed by the specious pretext of religion, end quote. Niccolo Manucci's 18th century editor, F.F. Cattru, made the same point even more explicitly, quote, Brahma enacted this law, end quote. A statement that combines the classical theory of the origins of sati with the Enlightenment construction of Hinduism as a religion, quote unquote, founded by a historical figure, Brahma. This mode of interpreting the origins of Hinduism, as with other non-Christian religions, was the result of the tendency of Enlightenment thought to view other religions in a teleological framework suggested to them by Christian tradition. As Williams and Marshall point out, quote, scriptures had been written and patterns of worship devised by a Muhammad, a Zoroaster, a Confucius, or a historical Brahma. For Cattru, the matter was automatically encompassed within the religious sphere because it was, quote-unquote, legislated upon by the, quote-unquote, founder of the, quote-unquote, of the Hindu, quote-unquote, religion. What a brilliant scholar. Remember her name. I followed her on Twitter only today. She's, I think, in just her mid-40s or 50s. She's a pretty young scholar. What a great paper, Andrea Major. While some authors thus tried to incorporate Strabo's account of Sati's origins into the new ideas about its religious status, others thought that Strabo should be refuted wholly. In his book, The Religious Tenets of the Gentoos, written in 1767, John Zephaniah Holwell denounced Strabo's explanation as lacking, quote, the smallest semblance of truth, end quote, and went on to argue that the purely voluntary nature of the rite precluded the possibility of it having been instituted by a civic enactment. Nevertheless, Holwell was not shy about offering his own unlikely explanation for the origins of the custom. Quote, at the demise of the mortal portal of the Gentoos' great lawgiver and prophet Brahma, hamara prophet bhi bana diya Brahma ko, his wives, inconsolable for his loss, resolved not to survive him and offered themselves voluntary victims upon his funeral pile. The wives of the chief Rajas, being unwilling to have it thought that they were deficient in fidelity and affection, followed the heroic example set them by the wives of Brahma, the wives of every Gentu, caught the enthusiastic now pious flame. और ये आर्ग्यूमेंट पॉसिबली पूरा का पूरा भोसरी का है, क्योंकि ये जो टेक्स्ट पे के बेसिस पे ये एक्सप्लेनेशन दे रहा है कि ब्रह्मा हमारा प्रॉफिट है. हाउ डू यू नो व्हेन इट वाज रिटन? How do you know it was not written after the Islamic invasions? Okay, it was always, every text was getting modified later on by some Brahmins. In fact, who was that one of the most famous Hindu kings? I don't remember in which era. Who had scolded some Brahmins, saying that अरे मतलब मैं जब छोटा था तब महाभारत के इतने सारे श्लोक थे या फिर इतने सारे वर्जन्स थे. मैं बड़ा हुआ हूं, अब इतने सारे बन गए हैं. मेरे मरने के बाद इतने सारे महाभारत बन जाएंगे. ये तुम हर कुछ एक एक चीज खुद में लिखी, या फिर आई थिंक दे सेड दिस अबाउट द मनुस्मृति और द महाभारत ओनली, दैट जो कुछ तुम्हारे दिमाग में आ रहा है सब कुछ घुसा रहे हो महाभारत में. क्यों? खुद का नाम दे के लिखो ना. तुम्हारा व्यू है, तुम अपने व्यू से कुछ एक और स्मृति या श्रुति नाम टेक्स्ट दे के लिखो. सब कुछ महाभारत के नाम पे क्यों चला रहे हो? ओके, इन ऑर्डर टू सेल योर वर्क, you are trying to get this into Mahabharata. So I guess Mahabharata was a sort of a sociological journal back then, that you have to get published in Routledge, Sage और Brill. तो तुम्हारा कोई व्यू पॉइंट है तो महाभारत में डाल दो. जो कुछ दिमाग में आ रहा है सब कुछ भोसरी के एक्सट्रापोलेट कर दो महाभारत पे. तो ये जो ब्रह्मा है हमारे प्रॉफिट, how do we know when it was written, by what intentions, by which Brahmin of which specific area of India? So example set them by the wives of Brahma, the wives of every Gentu, caught the enthusiastic now pious flame. Okay, let's continue. Dada, you should have a podcast episode with Andrea Major, yeah, I'm inclined to now. ये ना मुझे थोड़ा पॉडकास्ट के इन्विटेशंस करने के लिए ना थोड़ा टाइम निकालना पड़ेगा. बहुत लोगों को इनवाइट नहीं कर पा रहा हूँ. सुदीप तो वो तो आ रहे हैं क्योंकि उनके साथ व्हाट्सएप पे बात चलता रहता है. I have to invite Koshi Gangopadhyay to discuss free market capitalism in Bengali. I have to invite Declan Quigley. I think now I'll have to invite even Andrea Major, and I'll have to invite who was the scholar who wrote the most significant papers on Moritz Jhapi, whose paper we discussed? Ross Malik. Yeah, I came up. Mystery Sociologist got me his email ID as well. अब थोड़ा मुझे ना इन्विटेशंस के लिए टाइम निकालना पड़ेगा. एकदम टाइम ही नहीं मिलता है. मेरा खुद का बुक पढ़ना, पेपर, लाइव स्ट्रीम डिस्कशन, प्लानिंग, थंबनेल, मेरा म्यूजिक प्रोडक्शन का काम, उसमें बैठ के मेल करना, मेल में पोलाइट होके पूरा एक्सप्लेनेशन देखा कि प्लीज आइए, देखिए मेरा एक चैनल है, ऐसे डिस्कशन करना चाहता हूँ, फिर अपडेट्स फॉर, अच्छा अब नहीं होगा, कब होगा. मोस्ट ऑफ देम से दैट हिट मी अप 1 month later, 2 months later, देन हिटिंग देम अप अगेन. ये सब का टाइम नहीं मिल रहा है. ये थोड़ा करना पड़ेगा अभी. तो in literal terms, Holwell's story is as unfounded as the poisoning explanation, but it does have certain interesting resonances with more modern thought on the subject. As many 20th century scholars have suggested that sati may have begun as a practice among warrior castes, which is why even Meenakshi Jain points out the only Sati Mandir is in Rajasthan. What was in Rajasthan? Tribes who later gained the Kshatriya status. वो पेपर भी डिस्कस करना है एक दिन. Becoming Turks the Kshatriya way or becoming Rajputs the Turkish way, एक पेपर है ऐसा है. ठीक है. तो they were basically warring tribes, good at war, who became, let's say, who joined the Hindu fold as we know it today by becoming the Kshatriya caste. So they were the ones mainly practicing sati. Sati may have begun as many 20th century scholars have suggested that sati may have begun as a practice among warrior castes, which was then adopted by other groups in an attempt to improve their ritual status. Yes, यही तो होता है, यही तो एस्पिरेशनल मॉडल है. अब रिचुअल स्टेटस ग्रुप में तुम ऊपर जाओ, देखो क्यों, कैसे जाओगे? बाय हैविंग योर कल्चरल कैपिटल, बाय हैविंग योर कल्चरल परचेस पावर. कल्चरल परचेस पावर क्या है? वो ऊपर वाले जो कर रहे हैं वही करो. आज के दिन में एक बहुत कॉमन फेनोमेनन है, बंगालियों को पसंद होगा, बहुत सारे बंगालीज को शायद दुख भी होगा मैं ये बोल रहा हूं इसलिए, बट नॉन बंगालीज विल फाइंड इट फैसिनेटिंग दैट the way you non Bengalis see Bengali Durga Puja portrayed, that everyone wearing the I don't know what it's called, lal pad and the white sari, a sort of a palatial place. It has a corridor or a courtyard where the puja is being celebrated, and everyone putting on red colors on everyone's faces and stuff, women dancing and stuff. Okay, that is a very very specific way uh, of celebrating Durga Puja, only and only in the richest zamindar families. It used to happen in Bangladesh, and today that culture goes on only and only in North Calcutta, where those families still exist, even though their descendants mostly don't live here. They have gone outside because capitalism is fucking great, and most of them hate capitalism and USA as well. But anyway, so Bengalis elsewhere have always celebrated Durga Puja completely differently. But today somehow we are supposed to. I would go far ahead and use the word. I think, let's say, it's being thrusted upon the Bengali society that is the only way to celebrate Durga Puja, which is therefore being followed and gobbled up by everyone from everywhere, because that has become the status symbol that, oh, this is our culture, we must celebrate it that way, and therefore we come across as a cool authentic Bengalis as well. Let me tell you a fascinating story about a music colleague of mine. He's a rock vocalist, used to have his own band, very popular. It used to be a very popular band. So he got invited into a Bengali channel called Shongit Bangla one day, I think 2-3 years back, for a Durga Puja program, to do some unplugged versions of some songs, their original compositions, and some old Bengali songs as well. So he had decided that he always wears either a kurta or a shirt, and later on during the show he takes off his shirt, wears just the tank top, or goes fully topless. So when he goes to the studio of Shongit Bangla, he finds the anchor. I don't remember if it was Shongit Bangla. It's probably Shongit Bangla. So the anchor is all decked up in the specifically North Calcutta Bengali Brahmin or Kayastha Bodhi look. She has red color on her face and stuff, and they are all prepared for the shot. And someone asks my friend, the vocalist, to change and get decked up only in that specifically very North Calcutta Brahman Bodhi Kayastha Durga Puja celebration look. And he says, no. First of all, why is my dress important here? Secondly, that is not how everyone celebrates Durga Puja. How the fuck do you think a rickshaw puller celebrates Durga Puja? He suddenly buys white pajama Punjabi, and his wife suddenly buys great Lalpal Shada Shari, and they apply sindoor on each other's faces and dance around in joy. So I don't identify with that culture, even though my friend is Brahmin himself. So he's sort of a heterodox in his own community. So he says, that is not my way of celebrating Durga Puja. Everyone can celebrate Durga Puja in their own way, and I celebrate it by absolutely even worshipping. He comes from a devout Shakta family, but I just won't wear that specific set of clothes. So then they had a war of words, and he said fuck you and left the studio. But you see, that is how customs and traditions are made, because now the aspirational model for all of West Bengal's Bengalis is that is how we have to celebrate Durga Puja. And soon, in 500 years, someone is going to say, some texts say that is actually the religious way of celebrating Durga Puja. There's no other way. That is how customs and traditions and actually, let's say, rules are born in society. Okay, let's continue now. In an attempt to improve their ritual status. Another influence on the emerging European understanding of Sati was the construction of Hindu society as inherently devout. Ye hai Amartya Sen's brilliant point in the book Identity and Violence. He has made some great points, some hilarious, hypocritical points, but one of my favorite points from that he made in that book is that, which is actually, he wrote that book in 2006. He did not know what would be the arguments of Hindutva today. I don't know. I don't think he knows any Hindutva arguments even today. He doesn't listen to the Hindutva side at all. Because many things he said in that book is actually argued by today by Hindutvadis only, that India was great in mathematics, science, etc. in the past. Then he mentions that famous point that Indians kind of accepted that ये आध्यात्मिकता हमारा है, science तो Westerns का है, वो तो हमसे नहीं हो पाएगा. So this is where those notions are beginning, which were later accepted. lying down by us, our ancestors. That another influence on the emerging European understanding of sati was the construction of Hindu society as inherently devout. हम सिर्फ devout ही है और कुछ नहीं है. हमारा हमारा business नहीं है, invention, science, math, अर्थशास्त्र कुछ नहीं है. हम सिर्फ devout है. सुबह से शाम सिर्फ हम पूजा पाठ करते हैं. Which was based on new ideas about the nature of non-Christian religions. Although the medieval belief that pagan deities were incarnations of demons and devils had largely been discredited by the 18th century, the precise nature of the newly discovered religions and their implications for Christianity remained the subject of considerable debate. Thus, it was generally assumed that the various belief systems of the non-European world could be neatly compartmentalized into separate religions, all of which, like Christianity, had their own historical tradition and a distinct body of doctrine preserved in sacred writings. This mode of interpretation led to a growing tendency to view the non-Muslim peoples of India as all being adherents to a single overarching devotional system, which could be understood as a coherent religion comparable to Christianity. Hindu religion, in its supposedly pure form, as preserved in its religious texts, received considerable approbation from certain sections of the intellectual community for its internal moral integrity. The religion practiced by the majority of the populace was deemed to be a very different beast entirely, polytheistic, idolatrous, and steeped in superstitions fostered by an unscrupulous priesthood to keep the masses in subjugation. Customs such as sati were viewed as the self-interested impositions of an almost omnipotent priesthood. All-powerful priest. एक priest अचानक उठ के बोलेगा मारो सारे बहुओं को, कल से तुम शूद्रा, कल से तुम ब्राह्मण. Actually, कल से तुम ब्राह्मण तो होता था because of sanctions, but not in that way. When I'm making fun of that, I mean that कल से वर्ण व्यवस्था चालू होगा, कल से जातिवाद आएगा, and everyone listens almost immediately. That kind of all-encompassing, all-powerful priesthood. Holwell, which has been absolutely fucking debunked by Declan Quigley and also to some certain extent by Nicholas Dirks. Holwell, for example, explained the transmutation of sati into a religious rite as follows. The Brahmins had given it the stamp of religion. They foisted it into the Chata and Ogtora Bhades. Ye kya hai? Chata and Ogtora Bhades, and instituted forms and ceremonials which were to accompany the sacrifice, straining some obscure passages of Brahma's Charta Bhade. I've never heard of this word. To countenance their declared sense of the action and established it as a religious tenet throughout Hindustan. तो जब कोई ब्राह्मण को बुलाया जा रहा है सैंक्शन करने को, वो सिर्फ बेचारा सैंक्शन करके भाग रहा है. उसका सैंक्शन के वजह से अचानक, मतलब उसके वजह से वो फेनोमेनन शुरू होता है, सब फॉलो करने लगते हैं इमीडिएटली, अगले दिन से अपने बहुओं को जलाना शुरू कर देते हैं. वैसा नहीं है. इट वाज अ सोसाइटल फेनोमेनन. देयर वर डिफरेंट इंसेंटिव स्ट्रक्चर्स फॉर इट टू गो ऑन, or maybe different disincentive structures to not do it, which was being sanctioned. And later on, this passage is fascinating for the way you see, picking teams becomes so problematic here. Hamara therefore team can't be anything other than Hindu survival today, because यहाँ पे हम कौन सा टीम चूज करें, and ये टीम चूज करने के चुतियापे में ही the dumb Hindutwadi voices and the evil commie voices both come up with the wrong interpretations of society, and therefore both of them are not effective in solving any societal problems. The stupid Hindutwadis actually at least want to solve some societal problems. They think that those problems must not go on. The commies pretend to solve those problems and don't anyway, because they probably don't even want it, or they don't know that they don't want it, and their modes are dishonest anyway. This passage is fascinating for the way it foreshadows by nearly 100 years the discovery of Horace Hayman Wilson of the ontological error that underpinned the supposed Vedic authority for the rite. Holwell here casts doubt on the authenticity of the Sati rite as a religious act by questioning the reliability of the Brahmins who consecrated it as such. Of course, the Brahmins had long been seen as active instigators and beneficiaries of the rite, and the purity of their motives in encouraging the widow to the pyre had been often called into question. But the supposed dynamics of the Brahmins' involvement in transforming a custom into a religious rite, though previously hinted at, had never before been expressed so clearly. Nevertheless, Holwell had numerous precursors and imitators, some not quite so judicious. Bernard Picard, writing in the 1730s, who are stupid Hindutwadis? Those who would say that Sati never happened, we were such a great society that Sati never happened, end of story. Or that Sati happened, it's a great thing. Nevertheless, Holwell had numerous precursors and imitators, some not quite so judicious. Bernard Picard, writing in the 1730s, described the religious benefits promised to the sati patronizingly. It is very difficult for persons who are buoyed up with such pleasing hopes to be guided by the right dictates of cool reason. And how indeed should they, when not only their intellects are so weak, but they so implicitly believe every doctrine which their designing priests are pleased to impose on them? Thus, it is that conscience turned topsy turvy runs such exorbitant lengths, and even the most flagrant crimes are deemed the most virtuous and heroic actions. 70 years later, the Reverend William Tennant opined a trifle enviously, one might suggest, quote, various causes have been assigned for this unexampled fortitude of the sati, which perhaps is owing to the all-powerful effect of custom in this country, and the immediate hope of entering on a state of exquisite enjoyment. An Hindu no more thinks of evading the customary rites of religion than an European thinks of evading the unerring stroke of death. Its dictates appear to him the call of invincible necessity, to which he submits without reluctance, because unavoidable, and without choice, because ordered by the Brahmins. End quote. In turn, the essentialist image of the Hindus as subject to the total domination of their religion, as revealed to them through their priests, was reinforced by a conception of their submission to the unerring force of tradition. Asiatic society was repeatedly characterized through this period as static and unchanging. A particularly poignant image when we considered the European society at this time was thought to embody all that was best about progress and change. The Indian climate The Indian climate, its political institutions, and the predominance of religion in ordering people's lives were deemed to contribute towards a society which had changed very little over the centuries and which still closely resembled its distant antecedents. Specifically, sati was deemed to be proof of a characteristic tendency of Hindus to follow unquestioningly the dictate of their religion. Yes, yes. Moreover, the idea that Hindus were dominated by their religion became a self reinforcing one. Hindus committed sati because they were religious, and the fact that they did so was taken as proof of their religiosity. Where have I read this sentence? I think from a different paper in a live stream, we read this quote. Okay. I think, okay, okay. I remember from which paper. Yeah. Hindus committed sati because they were religious. They were religious because they committed sati. क्या brilliant justification है. Moreover, the idea that Hindus were dominated by their religion became a self reinforcing one. Hindus committed sati because they were religious, and the fact that they did so was taken as proof of their religiosity. The European view of Indian society allowed this paradox to exist uncontested. Questions of the chicken and the egg are largely irrelevant in the context of a people who have supposedly not altered for millennia. Yeah. जिसका supposedly कोई alteration नहीं हुआ है हजारों सालों से, उसका चिकन पहले आया या एग पहले आया, वो सोच के क्या काम. Reason, religion, and relativism. Sati and the debate about superstition. The image of Sati's acting out of religious conviction, whether falsely imposed on them or not, created a context in which personal sacrifice could be incorporated into a wider debate about the nature of religion. The new interpretation of pagan beliefs as manifestations of coherent religious systems represented a considerable theoretical challenge to the assumed superiority of the Christian faith. The philosophies with their rampant anti-clericalism and distaste for religious dogmatism were fascinated by the new religions of the East, primarily due to the belief that if their antiquity and internal moral integrity could be confirmed, it might be used to undermine the pretensions of the Christian churches to represent the one true faith. Some deists even went as far as to argue that God had revealed himself in many ways, at many different times, and to many different peoples, of course. A belief in which natural religion was not entirely incompatible with certain aspects of Christianity, which allowed for the possibility of instinctive devotion. But the suggestion that this could be expanded to validate extensive and extremely ancient religious systems in other parts of the world represented a considerable threat to Orthodox Christianity and its worldview. Fortunately for the faithful, this threat could be countered by magnifying the discreditable aspects of quote-unquote Hindu culture, such as sati. Missionaries seeking to defend Christianity at the expense of quote-unquote Hinduism first made sati a religious issue and then used it to discredit that religion. Listen to this. Missionaries seeking to defend Christianity at the expense of Hinduism first made Sati a religious issue and then used it to discredit that religion. This is being said by a scholar who was in University of Edinburgh when she was writing this and is now in University of Leeds. This can't get more credential than this. Okay. Use this quote everywhere. In any paper you write, in credentialed journals. In particular, Sati was used to point up the wickedness of doctrine of transmigration. Sati was used to point up the wickedness of the doctrine of transmigration. The Abbé de Guyon or Guyon, who was for the most part relatively sympathetic to Indian society and culture, declared, quote, among all these customs, there are few which do not redound to the praise of the Indians, but the sentiments some of them entertained to death cannot be excused. They looked upon it with such indifference as must be a shock to nature, if reason and religion teach not to hope for a better state. And I could well argue that this happened because they were seeing a society which was fed up with violence and death because of the Islamic invasions. Quote, this practice is founded on their notions of their metempsychosis, which passes among them as an undoubted truth. End quote. He added meaningfully. Meanwhile, the horrors of Sati and its implications for the fate of the victims' souls continued to provide ammunition for the missionary enterprise. Telsher includes a fascinating instance in India inscribed, taken from the Jesuits' Letters Edifantes, in which a Sati, having listened to the discourses of her Christian servant, announces at the moment of her sacrifice, quote, alas, what does human happiness lead to? I am well aware that I am about to throw myself alive into hell, end quote. Ahaha. Christian branding of Satina. The widow then invoked the names of her gods before throwing herself into the flames. The anomaly created by the pagan woman espousing a Christian frame of reference in her conception of suicide is striking, but the utility of such a story to the missionary cause is clear, that the teachings of the Bible could and did infiltrate the Hindu mind and inspire it with right thought, even when conversion did not take place. Brilliant. Actually, this has been argued by even Jesai Deepak in India, that is Bharat, no? That either they will convert you or they will convert your religion itself, which is the case kind of today. कि वो भगवान तो ATM है, ऊपर बैठा है. So, the teachings of the Bible could and did infiltrate the Hindu mind and inspire it with right thought, even when conversion did not take place. Given the singular lack of success the missionaries were experiencing in converting meaningful numbers of high caste Hindus to Christianity, such an image was very useful. ये है subtle messaging. Holy shit. ये क्या लिख रही है? Moreover, the widow provided a potent image of the battle of conversion, internally struggling as she was between the truth of Christianity and the inexorable weight of false custom and religion. The image of the Sati was not only a handy tool for missionaries and churchmen, however, it could also be employed to attack religious bigotry and dogma generally, as Voltaire did in Zadig, published in 1747. At one stage, his hero Zadig prevents a widow from committing sati, persuading her to admit that she had detested her husband and that she was only committing sati in deference to others and to gratify her own vanity. Zadig also manages to persuade the leaders of the tribe to abolish the custom when his friend Setok asks, quote, for more than 1,000 years, women have had the right to burn themselves. Which of us shall dare to alter a law which time has consecrated? Is there anything more respectable than an ancient abuse? End quote. Zadig, in typical Enlightenment fashion, replies, quote, reason is more ancient, end quote. In this way, Voltaire used the issue of sati to attack superstition and religious dogmatism in general. As Dorothy Figuera comments, for Voltaire, the sati, quote unquote, represented the ideal victim of religious superstition. Despite his admiration for what he considered to be the essence of Hinduism, Voltaire remained violently opposed to sati. Others, though, took a more sympathetic stance influenced by the Enlightenment push for tolerance. Holwell, for example, went to considerable pains to place the rite in its Hindu context and showed a commendable willingness to grapple with the metaphysical principles that underpinned belief in it. Indeed, very few other European writers before or since have put forward so impassioned a plea for an understanding of the rite. Quote, Let us view, as we should every other action, without prejudice, and sort of decolonial view from an European, okay? Without prejudice, and without keeping always in sight our own tenets and customs and prepossessions that too generally result therefrom to the injury of others. If we view these women in a just light, we shall think more candidly of them, and confess they act upon heroic as well as rational and pious principles. They are nursed and instructed in the firm faith that this voluntary sacrifice is the most glorious period of their lives, and that thereby the celestial spirit is released from its transmigrations and evils of a miserable existence, and flies to join the spirit of their departed husband in a state of purification. Add to this the subordinate consideration of raising the lustre of their children and contributing by this action to their temporal prosperity. All these, it must be owned, are prevalent motives for cheerfully embracing death. Although these principles are in general so diametrically contrary to the prevailing spirit and genius of our fair countrywomen, yet we will depend on their natural goodness of heart, generosity, and candor, that they will in future look on their Gentoo sisters of the creation in a more favorable and consistent light than probably they have hitherto done, and not deem that action an infatuation that results from principle. End quote. He was trying to be fair. What followed, however, was more radical still. Holwell went on to openly conflate sati with Christian martyrdom, suggesting that European history afforded illustrious examples in both sexes of voluntary sacrifices by fire, because they would not subscribe even to a different mode of professing the same faith. Unusually for his time, Holwell approached the subject of sati from the viewpoint of the cultural relativist, seeing it as a rational choice when viewed within the framework of Hindu social religious belief, which means that let Sharia law happen in Muslim communities in India or England. But even European commentators, who could not find it in themselves to excuse sati theologically, sometimes admitted a sneaking admiration for the bravery and moral conviction of the participants. As the Reverend Tennant commented in 1803, human nature is not always consistent, nor are the efforts of the mind always proportioned to our opportunities for exertion. Bred in scenes of the most voluptuous sensuality, these Indian ladies exhibit on occasion the most magnanimous exertion of fortitude of which history records any example. अच्छा अच्छा, ये compliment भी दे रहा है थोड़े थोड़े गाली के साथ, शायद, maybe it was the truth. For Tennant, the sati's heroism was made all the more noteworthy by the oppressive conditions of her former life, which he thought ought to have made such a sacrificial act impossible. Last subchapter, second last subchapter, original authorities textualizing sati in the late 18th century. Let's see now. The last quarter of the 18th century saw very significant changes in the structure of European and specifically British power in India. At the same time as the East India Company was consolidating its position as a ruling body and formulating a policy of governance for the territories that had come under its control, significant breakthroughs were being made in the collection and formulation of colonial knowledge about India. The relationship between the political expediencies of the colonial regime and its production of knowledge are too complicated to unravel fully here, but the impact of the new political and intellectual position of the observer on the understanding of sati was of considerable significance. Although sati had widely been held to be a religious rite for much of the 18th century, this assumption had been based primarily on observation rather than textual evidence. With the breakthroughs in the study of the Sanskrit language at the end of the 18th century, religious authenticity could now be quantified by reference to textual authority. Thus, in a work published in 1768, supposedly based on the Hindu Shastras, Alexander Dow firmly rejected the interpretation of sati as religious rite, concluding, quote, "The extraordinary custom of the women burning themselves with their deceased husbands has, for the most part, fallen into desuetude in India, nor was it ever reckoned a religious duty, as has been very erroneously supposed in the West." ये 1768 में बोल रहा है. Dow's textual sources are now widely believed to be spurious, but his rejection of the claim that the act of sati was a religious one was perhaps the opening salvo in the debate that would underpin the 19th century discourse on abolition. As it was, Dow's assertion prompted a sarcastic rebuttal from Nathaniel Brassey Halhed in the preface of his A Code of Gentoo Laws or Ordinations of the Pandits, published in 1776. Quote, how then shall we reconcile so splendid and exalted a benediction pronounced upon this spontaneous martyrdom? End quote. Halhed asked rhetorically, quote, with the assertion of an author that the custom for the wives to burn themselves with their husbands' bodies was never reckoned a religious duty in India? End quote. The Code of Gentoo Laws, though a major landmark, was soon superseded by William Jones's Institutes of Hindu Law. Yet, for my purposes, Halhed's is perhaps the more significant of the two works, since his list of quote-unquote Hindu ordinances, including one relating explicitly to Sati. There is no reference to Sati in Jones's Institutes of Hindu Law. It appeared in chapter 20 of the code, which dealt with women. It read, it is proper for a woman, after her husband's death, to burn herself in the fire with his corpse. Every woman who thus burns herself shall remain in paradise with her husband 3 crore and 50 lakhs of years by destiny. If she cannot burn, she must in that case preserve an inviolable chastity. If she remains always chaste, she goes to paradise. And if she does not preserve her chastity, she goes to hell. End quote. Although the quote-unquote ordinance unearthed by Halhed was very far from making sati an inviolable duty, it appeared to confirm both the legal and religious authenticity of sati as a Hindu rite. The first European to make a detailed study of the textual authority for sati was Henry Colebrook. Quote, on the duties of a faithful Hindu widow, end quote, which appeared in the, not quote, it's a name of the law or a text, which appeared in the 4th volume of Asiatic Researches in 1794, contained an inventory of the Shastric ordinances relating to sati and ascetic widowhood that he had uncovered. In this work, Colebrook recognized that sati was not an absolute imperative, as an alternative was sanctioned in the form of ascetic widowhood. Nevertheless, he insisted that, though an alternative be allowed, the Hindu legislators have shown themselves disposed to encourage widows to burn themselves with their husband's corpse. End quote. However, for all that, Colebrook's essay on sati did not represent a significant break with former ideas. Most informed Europeans by this time believed that sati was sanctioned by the Hindu religion, and also recognized that the alternative course of ascetic widowhood existed. Rather, its significance lies in the fact that it represented the first occasion, that is, if it's dependent on Hindu customs or Hindu texts, on which these ideas were put together, supported by direct quotations from Shastras. It was, in effect, the first attempt to codify the Hindu position on sati. In its concentration on the textual authority as the source of the most authentic information, the essay established a frame of reference for future debates. Let's take some footnotes. Although it might be tempting to ascribe this omission on William Jones's part, to a desire to avoid legitimizing a custom which the British found repugnant, the actual explanation would seem to be more mundane, namely that Jones's work was based solely on the Code of Manu, which makes no reference to sati whatsoever. Halhed quoted in Marshall, the British Discovery of Hinduism, page 253. This ordinance is also illustrative of the difficulties that were faced in translation during this period, condemning the widow as it does to a Christian construct such as hell. Although not an overtly political tract and presented in a scholarly journal, Colebrook's account illustrates the complex dynamics between power and knowledge during this period. His concentration on the scriptural authority of sati was indicative not only of his personal research interests, but also of the imperatives of a British governing agency in India, which would soon have to formulate policy on the subject. By eschewing interpretive material, Colebrook privileged scriptural authority above the intricacies of local custom. I find it very interesting that this entire time she does not even bring up Raja Ram Mohan Roy, which shows how insignificant he might have been in this endeavor. By eschewing interpretive material, Colebrook privileged scriptural authority above the intricacies of local custom and assumed a homogeneity of religious observance in India, which both reinforced earlier assumptions about the all-pervasive nature of Indian religion and created a framework through which this religion could now be studied with direct recourse to the people who actually practiced it. तो इसके लिए भोसले के codify. And that is always the biggest problem that the state can do. Fucking codify things into law which are going to be inevitable and have bad consequences from it. And therefore, when you codify it, you only amplify the bad consequences of that inevitable phenomenon. Now the conclusion. Codify why? So that they can understand better and rule better. Conclusion. By the time the then Governor General Lord Wellesley made the first tentative inquiries into the issue of legislation on sati in 1805, certain assumptions about the nature of the rite and the manner in which the issue should be addressed had become prominent. The religious status of sati had become an accepted fact, and the precise nature of the scriptural authority for it had become a key area of debate. The widow's agency and the sociological motivations for sati, so prominent in earlier accounts, had been effectively marginalized. Similarly, the 18th century willingness to see heroic elements in the rite was increasingly overlaid by a uniform stress on the role of manipulative priests and religious indoctrination. This increasing tendency to vilify left less and less room for Europeans to celebrate the courage and nobility of the unfortunate widows. What a great sentence. Listen to these last two sentences once again. The 18th century willingness to see heroic elements in the rite was increasingly overlaid by a uniform stress on the role of these manipulative priests and religious indoctrination. If at all it was being done by manipulative priests and religious indoctrination, it was fucking being incentivized by the state authorities. That is absolutely guaranteed. This increasing tendency to vilify left less and less room for Europeans to celebrate the courage and nobility of the unfortunate widows, and by the early 1800s, such generous sentiments found only fitful expression. The trends described in this paper, which were crystallizing by the end of the 18th century, would form the basis of European conceptions of sati in the early 19th century. However, just as they were products of specific historical conjunctures and processes, so too would they be modified and transformed by changing imperial imperatives. ये देखो, imperial imperative जब चेंज होता है, अचानक सोसाइटी में सबको ही एक्सेप्टिंग बन जाते हैं ऑफ द फैक्ट दैट ओके ठीक है सती बिना किए भी चलेगा. इतना अगर भोसड़ी के बिलीफ था, इतने अगर सारे चारों ओर मैनिपुलेटिव ब्राह्मण्स घूम रहे थे, तो बिलीफ कहाँ गया? अगले दिन क्या सब एथीस्ट बन गए थे? अगले दिन क्या वो इवल ब्राह्मण्स इवल नहीं रहे? या फिर उन्होंने बोला कि हाँ मैं इवल हूं मगर ठीक है चलो सती बिना किए भी चल जाएगा, ट्रांसमाइग्रेशन वैसे भी बढ़िया हो जाएगा. तो स्टेट जो चुतिया जो इंसेंटिवाइज करेगा वही होगा भाई. Would they be modified and transformed by changing imperial imperatives, by the rise of evangelicalism and utilitarianism at home, by growing missionary activity in India, and by generally changing European attitudes towards issues such as gender, suicide, and religion? एक footnote है. Charles Grant's book or paper, Observations on the State of Society Among the Asiatic Subjects of Great Britain, particularly with respect to morals and on the means of improving it, written chiefly in the year 1792, published in 1813, was an early example of the vilification of sati, among other things, which accompanied both growing evangelical feeling in Britain and the increasing need to justify colonialism at home in terms of social benefit to the ruled, as well as economic benefit to the rulers. Kya brilliant fucking paper hai. Oh. And she's being fair as well. Last line of the paper. European attitudes to sati in the 19th century would be no more static or homogeneous than those of the preceding centuries, but rather would continue to shift and mutate to fit the changing needs of the time. Whew. Next MS podcast is happening. Yeah, probably sometime next week. We will discuss. Wait, I won't spoil the topic right now. Indian state is essentially a controlling state which looks at Indian Hindu from a colonial lens. They think of us native savages who need to be tamed. Yes. Give the link to the PDF. अभी हम तो जे स्टोर में मिल जाएगा, ठीक है. जे स्टोर में 100 आर्टिकल एक मंथ में फ्री है, ठीक है. देखो जे स्टोर में मिलता है कि नहीं. नाम मैंने शुरू में डिस्कस कर लिया है, वहां से देख लेना. Andrea Majors is looking at sati from the perspective of British. Raja Rammohn Roy would be outside the scope of her study. Yeah. But I think it would make for some interesting tidbits, at least, nuggets at least, that what was the Indian elite thinking about it, or how they were also trying to fight it and stuff. The Indian state has continued categories of atrocities created by the British with the intention to target and divide the Hindu society. It was also an outcome of their stereotypical view. Yeah. Okay. This is the end of the live stream, guys. Thanks a lot for for joining the live stream. This was a great paper. I'm very hungry reading all this, consuming all this information now. Bye bye. Thanks for joining, guys.
श्रवरूढं महाभीमं गुणाद्रष्टाम्बरप्रदं हस्य युक्तं त्रिनेत्रं च कपालकर्णिकाकरां मुक्तकेशीं ललज्जयः पिबन्तीं रुधिरं चतुर्बाहु समायुक्तं वराभयकरं स्मरेत् चतुर्बाहु समायुक्तं वराभयकरं स्मरेत् काली काली महा